Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be discussing this fascinating new book from Cambridge University Press titled Propaganda in Autocracies: Institutions, Information and the Politics of Belief, written by Dr. Erin Baggott Carter and Dr. Brett Carter, the latter of whom I have with me on the podcast today to tell us all about this book that does a whole bunch of things. It creates a massive global data set of autocratic propaganda. It then does a bunch of interesting analysis of this and other sources to figure out how dictatorships, how autocracies use propaganda for different reasons in different ways. Anyway, this is kind of everything you could ever want to know about how propaganda works in autocracies and why. So, Brett, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast to tell us all about the book.
Great. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks so much for the kind invitation and for the kind words about the book as well.
Very happy to. Before we get into the book itself, though, could you please introduce yourself and your co-author Erin a little bit and explain why you wrote the book and why you wrote it together?
Yeah, of course. So I'm an assistant professor of political science and international relations at the University of Southern California, a Hoover Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and an affiliate at Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Erin is roughly has the same CV. She's also an assistant professor at USC and a fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and its Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law as well. So we decided to write the book. I suppose it has its origins in a series of conversations a few years ago when we realized just how differently the propaganda apparatuses and the two parts of the world that we knew best, in my case, Central Africa, in Erin's case, China, how profoundly different they look to readers. So the Republic of Congo is Africa's third or fourth leading oil producer. If one were to look at its oil production on a per capita basis, it's on par with, say, Libya, Iran, Iraq, so major oil producers. It also, due to senior or mismanagement by senior officials in the government, routinely experiences fuel shortages. And it turns out the propaganda apparatus actually covers these fuel shortages, tells them or tells readers about them, which is to say that the propaganda apparatus routinely concedes the regime's shortcomings, and obviously there are many. But it does so, right, to try to build up some capacity, some kind of credibility to persuade citizens of useful fictions, right, whenever it needs them. By contrast, I learned from Erin whenever we began the project, the CCP's propaganda apparatus looks entirely different to readers. For the most part, it kind of has a somewhat threatening tone. It's sort of overwhelmingly effusive, and the question that initially motivated the project is why are these two propaganda apparatuses so fundamentally different, right? And why did they tell their citizens such different things? So that's kind of where the idea for the book began.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think introduces a bunch of threads that we'll now sort of pull at through the rest of our conversation. The first kind of being the answer to that question. Can you walk us through the theory that you propose in the book to explain autocratic propaganda?
Yeah, of course. So again, the core of the book is trying to understand why the world's autocrats employ such different propaganda strategies. So at least, anyways, our intuitions, from Congo and from China had sort of initially led us to believe. And our basic answer is that the world's autocrats use propaganda for different reasons based on the electoral constraints that they confront, right? And so we kind of think of electoral constraints broadly, right, as sort of the extent to which autocrats are bound to the preferences of their citizens, right? In some autocracies, think again, China. Governments, are essentially able to tilt the electoral playing field virtually unlimited, right, or in a virtually unlimited way. Their capacity for repression is so substantial that they're generally not bound by by kind of popular support. By contrast, right, in a place like the Republic of Congo, many of Africa's autocracies, governments sort of can tilt the electoral playing field only to a degree, right? And this may be for a range of reasons. Perhaps they're more bound to kind of abide nominally democratic institutions as a result of international pressure. They may be particularly vulnerable to international pressure given reliance on aid from foreign sources. Perhaps they confront vibrant civil societies. They're able to kind of compel them to sort of abide electoral outcomes. And so anyway, so we sort of think of the world's autocrats as existing on this continuum, right, from essentially entirely unconstrained by elections, by kind of popular will, and on kind of the other spectrum, potentially quite constrained, right? So again, think Africa's post-Cold War autocracies. So anyway, so that's kind of our starting point. Then, kind of secondly, we also think of politics in the world's autocracies as being kind of fundamentally uncertain, right? And in particular, we kind of think of citizens as having two sources of uncertainty. The first is uncertainty about the regime's performance, right? To what extent it's providing public goods, to what extent it's sort of making a good faith effort to advance living standards. And then the second broad source of uncertainty that citizens have is about the regime's capacity for oppression, right? And this is something, whether, how effectively the regime will be able to employ repression in the case of some kind of popular mobilization, right? Protests in the streets. Anyway, so citizens are uncertain potentially about both of these two things. And in our view, the world's autocrats use propaganda kind of broadly to shape citizens' beliefs about kind of both of those sources of uncertainty. If helpful, I'm happy to kind of go through kind of the world of kind of non-binding electoral constraints in say the case of China. So we sort of think of the world of non-binding electoral constraints as autocrats having kind of an incentive to make this capacity for repression common knowledge among citizens. And so there are obviously there are lots of ways that the world's repressive governments can kind of signal their capacity for repression. Obviously, repressing citizens is obviously a good signal, right? But repression is costly. We know, for instance, that whenever autocrats repress citizens, that kind of the anniversaries of those kinds of large-scale human rights abuses end up being focal moments for popular protests in the future, right? We also know that repression can elicit a backlash effect potentially, and kind of create more popular frustration than perhaps it suppresses. Anyway, so which is all to say that repression is potentially costly, and so in many cases, the world's autocrats prefer to use kind of a less costly signal of their capacity for repression. And this is how we think of propaganda in the world of non-binding electoral constraints, right? So in a world like, say, Xi Jinping's China, Uzbekistan is another good example. We show that their sort of use of propaganda basically is like absurd. They're just kind of the word that we use in the book, right? So they broadcast information that citizens know is false, right? And in so doing, because citizens know it's false, the regime is effectively telling everyone all at once that the regime's survival doesn't really depend on their support, right? But rather on the capacity of its repressive apparatus to suppress them. So again, we think of, in this case, propaganda in the world's most repressive autocracies as a signal that the regime's survival doesn't really rest on citizen support, but instead on the capacity of its repressive apparatus. then, in the world where electoral constraints are more binding, so again, think like the Republic of Congo, many of Africa's post-Cold War autocracies. In this case, the regime's incentive, because of these binding electoral constraints, because the regime is to a greater extent, kind of bound, is forced to be responsive to citizens. This has kind of broadly two effects. First, it compels them to provide some amount of public goods to citizens, right? And it also kind of compels them to kind of use the propaganda apparatus to curry popular support. And we kind of think, of these two effects as kind of broadly consistent, right? So whenever governments are forced to provide some degree of public goods, right, then that gives them the opportunity to mix fact and fiction, right? So governments can essentially exploit the fact that they provide public goods sometimes, right, to use the propaganda apparatus to foster uncertainty about bad news and policy failures, right? So we think of this as honest propaganda, right? So persuading citizens of regime merits, requires occasionally conceding policy failures. Conceding policy failures is costly, right? Because it provides potential focal point for protests and coups. But nonetheless, in the world where electoral constraints are more binding, we think of honest propaganda, right? So again, sort of mixing fact and fiction is an investment in making sort of actual propaganda work to some extent.
Wow, that was impressively comprehensive, going through all of that theory. Thank you for laying it out so clearly and giving me a number of things, obviously, to ask you to give us examples about, because the book is not just theory. The book has a whole bunch of data in it. Can you tell us about what data and empirical methods you used after laying out this theory to then test it in real life?
Yeah, of course. So we, it was so obviously we kind of came to this, theory over a series of lunchtime conversations based on our experiences in China and Central Africa. But it was important to us, empirically, to subject the theory to kind of as much scrutiny as we possibly could. So we collected what we think is the world's largest archive of propaganda and autocracies. So our corpus of propaganda encompasses somewhere around 70 newspapers from about 65 countries. And in some, about 8 million kind of discrete pieces of propaganda. We work in 6 of the world's major languages. Obviously, English, we're both native speakers. French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, and then Mandarin as well. And so finally, our total corpus of propaganda comprises about 88% of the world's population that lives under autocracy. So anyway, so we think that this is, as sort of, encompassing a collection of propaganda as has ever been assembled.
It is pretty comprehensive, just from that list alone of the languages. So we now have the theory. We've got this massive data set to play with. What then did you find in terms of autocratic propaganda? I mean, that's kind of, I guess, the big picture question for the next few questions underneath it. So if we take the theory and the data and put them together, and we look at just kind of one piece of that test, I'd love you to tell us about the fall of the Berlin Wall and what we can learn from looking at that.
Yeah, of course. Actually, so maybe I can back up just kind of a thought or two. So once we kind of amassed this collection of propaganda, then we first had to figure out how to measure it, right? So I mean, so obviously there are a number of empirical contributions to the book, one of which was collecting this data, but then obviously there's a question of precisely how we go about measuring propaganda. And so we kind of do this in kind of 2 broad ways. First, we wanted to focus on kind of pro-regime propaganda somewhat narrowly construed, right? Sort of focusing more on the incumbent, the ruling party. And so in this set of 8 million propaganda articles, we used a series of natural language processing techniques to basically identify every reference to the incumbent and the ruling party. And we're able to do so with roughly 85 to 90% accuracy. And then for every one of those references, in every one of those articles, we measure the positive and the valence of the words immediately surrounding the reference with a series of tools from computational linguistics. In particular, there's something called the Harvard General Inquirer, which kind of basically kind of categorizes languages into or categorizes words into positive and negative valence. Anyway, so then we kind of measure the valence of the words immediately surrounding every reference, and we sort of think of this as reflecting our view of propaganda, and I think a view that's pretty widely shared, which is that propaganda should be thought of as spin rather than lies. And then but the second way we set about measuring pro-regime propaganda is reflects the notion that it's sort of unclear whether we should think of pro-regime propaganda as focusing exclusively on the executive, the ruling party, or whether we should also think of pro-regime propaganda as kind of encompassing kind of broader government action, right? So to some extent, this kind of reflects some uncertainty about kind of like what the regime is, right? If we're trying to set out to measure pro-regime propaganda, anyway, and so this this kind of I suppose this sort of uncertainty as to sort of how encompassing we should think of the regime as being leads to our second way of measuring pro-regime propaganda, which is by using something called multi-label topic models. So this is kind of a branch of machine learning, where we're essentially able to kind of train the computer to identify whether a given article, in a given language from a given country on a given day, references government action by, at sort of any branch of the government. And we're able to identify content about government agents at kind of any level with about 90% accuracy. And so the broad result of the book is that as electoral constraints grow more binding, right? So think again as we kind of move from the world of Xi Jinping's China and Uzbekistan under especially Islam Karimov to say Central Africa's autocrats, that the effusiveness of pro-regime propaganda declines pretty markedly. Then the question is like, well, how marked is the decline in effusiveness, right? I mean, so we've assembled, all this data, and we, try to figure out, or we try to propose a way to kind of quantitatively measure the effusiveness of pro-regime propaganda across countries, right? But then, how do we kind of convey, say like one measure, or how do we convey kind of the magnitude of that decline? So in the book, we propose, or we kind of scale our measures of propaganda, using a partisan media outlet that we think many readers will have a pretty intuitive sense for. And that is Fox News. In particular, we propose something called the Fox News Index, right? So we compute the valence of Fox News's coverage of Republicans over about a 6-month period, and I think this was 2019 or 2018, 2019. And then we computed the valence of its coverage for Democrats. And we take kind of the difference in that valence, and that then becomes our Fox News Index, right? And so what we find is that state-affiliated newspapers, So what we find is that state-run newspapers in more constrained autocracies. So again, think Russia before the Ukraine invasion. Think autocracies in Central Africa after the Berlin Wall fell. The difference between state and kind of pro-regime coverage in state in state-run newspapers and constrained autocracies is about 1 unit of our Fox News index more pro-regime than coverage of the government in state-affiliated newspapers and democracies, right? So we sort of think of, again, the propaganda apparatus in Vladimir Putin's Russia before the Ukraine war. I'm sure that, after the Ukraine war, my sense is that censorship has expanded, repression has expanded, and propaganda has increased as well. But kind of roughly that difference is like equivalent to the difference in how Fox News covers Republicans relative to Democrats. In a place like Xi Jinping's China, we find that the propaganda apparatus covers the regime roughly 4 times more positively than Fox News covers Republicans relative to Democrats, right? And so anyway, so there's a lot of evidence that Fox News is quite persuasive, which is sort of again kind of what we would expect, right? Xi Jinping's propaganda apparatus is effusive. It doesn't really aim to persuade readers, but instead to intimidate them. By contrast, propaganda apparatuses in a world of more binding electoral constraints, roughly similar to how Fox News covers Republicans relative to Democrats, which was, and remind me, your question was about China and Gabon.
Right. Now that we've laid out kind of how we're doing all this, which is really helpful, how do we then see this in a particular instance of the fall of the Berlin Wall and how Gabon versus China talk about that?
Yeah, of course. So we obviously want to take threats to causal inference, as seriously as we can, right? And so one potential critique of the theory and of kind of the baseline statistical results is that maybe it's not binding electoral constraints that is kind of causing less propaganda, right? So but maybe instead propaganda is actually kind of loosening electoral constraints, right? So maybe then the argument is that so if this kind of reverse causality is the case, maybe it's the case that governments that employ more propaganda are able to sort of make their electoral constraints less binding. And so in the book, the way that we try to rule out the reverse causality possibility is to exploit a rapid exogenous change to electoral constraints in a large set of countries, and kind of one to us kind of the most substantial kind of rapid exogenous shock to electoral constraints was the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, right? So the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall unleashes a third wave of democracy. This is felt obviously across Eastern Europe, but no less in sub-Saharan Africa, right, where proxy wars during the Cold War basically served to prop up client governments of both Moscow and Washington. Anyway, so if one were to look at a map of political institutions across the African continent in, say, 1985 relative to 1995, obviously many of the continent's autocracies collapsed whenever the Berlin Wall fell, but virtually all that survived were essentially forced to govern with nominally democratic institutions, right, with term limits, constitutions, regular elections, opposition parties, some amount of media freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So it's difficult to get propaganda that extends back to the 1970s, 1980s, before the Berlin Wall fell, before the third wave was unleashed. But for 2 countries, it turns out we were able to find this data. Excuse me. The first is Gabon, and the second is CCP China. Anyway, so we use a series of statistical techniques to show to show first that there's a sharp discontinuity in the propaganda strategy, in the level of pro-regime propaganda that the Gabonese government used before the Berlin Wall fell, relative to after, right? So if you were to look at our measures of pro-regime coverage in the Gabonese propaganda apparatus, a year or two before the Berlin Wall fell, far different than the nature of pro-regime coverage after. And so then we use something called a Bayesian change point model. So we know that there's a discontinuity in its propaganda strategy. And so then we use something called a Bayesian change point model to help isolate when precisely the propaganda strategy changed, right? So we can, in particular, we can sort of pinpoint, or we can use a statistical model to pinpoint the month when the Gabonese government's propaganda strategy changed. And precisely as our theory would expect, again, given our focus on electoral constraints, the statistical results suggest that the propaganda strategy most likely changed during the month of the first multi-party elections since 1967, and then perhaps secondarily, I should say that was in September 1990. Secondarily, the strategy could have also shifted maybe around March 1990, which was when the Gabonese government called a national conference to basically kind of outline the set of democratic reforms. Anyway, so as I said, the second country for which we have propaganda data that extends back decades is CCP China. In this case, I think we have data that goes back to 1946, and precisely as our theory would expect, we basically observed no change in CCP China, which again, CCP China wasn't exposed to to kind of this rapid exogenous shock that the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, basically represented in Gabon.
That is a fascinating example to understand kind of how the theory and the data and all the analysis comes through. So thank you for taking us through that one. That obviously is kind of one type of news, right? The idea, as you said, of the massive shock, the potentially existential shock. But that doesn't come up that often. Much more frequently, any government has to think about, for example, economic and public goods and how those are going to be covered in the news. How does autocratic propaganda work on those topics?
Yeah, so let's see. We show that the rate of kind of coverage that explicitly focuses on a regime across propaganda apparatuses is actually pretty low, right? Say 10, 15, 20%, not really that high, right? By contrast, just 5 topics like the economy, politics, sports, and then international news, international kind of diplomacy. Those 5 topics account for roughly 80 to 85% of all coverage in the world's propaganda apparatuses, right? So focusing on propaganda is much more than simply pro-regime coverage, right? It's also narratives that that we think of as kind of constituting the first draft of a country's history. So in the later chapters of the book, we basically use our kind of core theory of autocratic propaganda to try to understand variation in narratives and propaganda narratives that the world's autocrats employ. And so, one that we sort of think of as particularly salient is coverage of the economy, of public goods. Think like education, health, etc. One of my favorite examples of the book is contrasting how propaganda apparatuses in Central Africa relative to the Chinese propaganda apparatus covered the government or their government economic policies during shocks, right? During crises. So, for the Republic of Congo, the obvious economic crisis is the fuel shortage, or the fuel shortages that citizens confront more often than one would imagine, given the government status as Africa's 4th leading oil producer. And for the Chinese government, the global financial crisis kind of constituted, a similar sort of economic shock, right? That kind of undermined the government's claims or potential claims to performance legitimacy. And so again, exactly as our theory would suggest, we show that when governments that confront electoral constraints, so again, think Congo, whenever those governments confront economic crises, they sort of fully acknowledge them to citizens, and they include examples that would sort of from afar one would think of as sort of likely to elicit even more popular frustration, right? To kind of make the government's failures common knowledge. So so one excerpt of a propaganda article from Congo during a fuel crisis was sort of recounting how citizens were lining up early in the mornings, to try to get fuel, which for the price of which was skyrocketing, right? So so the government kind of fully acknowledged the depth of the crisis. I mean, of course, it also emphasized the government's attempts to rectify the crisis, but it also acknowledged the government's so far its inability to do so. By contrast, the People's Daily, which is the flagship propaganda newspaper for the CCP, the tenor, the kind of the valence of its economic coverage actually increased during the global financial crisis, which is to say that the government covered the economy even like more positively during the global financial crisis than it did before, right? Which is sort of again in our view a way of sort of telling citizens that the government's survival doesn't really rest on their support, but instead on its instead on their acquiescence, right? Instead on its capacity for repression.
I think the particular example you mentioned of covering things more positively during the financial crisis was absolutely fascinating to read.
Yeah, it was pretty striking when we found it.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. You mentioned kind of the big categories of topics that are covered. Obviously, the economy is one. Can you tell us about sports and how that turns up in autocratic propaganda?
Yeah. So it turns up actually pretty frequently. Roughly 20% of all coverage, across the world's autocracies is allocated to sports. I should say, by contrast, if one were to look at independent newspapers across the world, those aren't a focus of this book, but we've looked at some in other related work. The share of sports coverage is much lower, and we think of this. We think of sports coverage as to some degree potentially like a loss leader, right? In the sense that propaganda is effective when it's consumed, right? And so providing sports coverage, right, things that people want to read, is a way of attracting readers. And I should say that we discovered that the world's propaganda apparatuses include lots of other general interest things. Horoscopes were one particular favorite, dating advice, relationship advice, etc. Anyway, so we sort of think of these across autocracies as a way to kind of ensure that to attract readers, to ensure that propaganda is consumed. So that's kind of the first way that we think of sports coverage, right? It's sort of providing information that citizens want to consume, the better to expose them to propaganda. But again, our basic theoretical prediction is that in constrained autocracies, sports coverage should be subjected to the same kinds of admissions of bad news and policy failures that governments are forced to make in other aspects of their coverage, in coverage of the economy that we just talked about. So, for instance, Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, again, one of the continent's longest standing autocrats, but again, who's relied on Western governments for development aid, for debt relief, and in some cases for weapons. And so this kind of reliance, to some extent, constrains his ability to oppress citizens. And so we think of this as we think of him as being somewhat more constrained than than other autocracies. Anyway, so in his propaganda apparatus, which I should say was run by a British citizen whose diaries whose diaries read as though they were taken from the theory chapter of our book, somewhat remarkably. Anyway, so his propaganda apparatus kind of covered the government's failures to invest in Uganda's national sports teams. Whenever the Ugandan national soccer team, for instance, fails to advance in the African Cup of Nations, it's the journalists in its propaganda apparatus lay the blame heavily at the government's failure to invest enough. By contrast, in autocracies that are less constrained by electoral institutions, who are fully able to secure themselves with repression, coverage of sports is as effusive and as absurd as the CCP's coverage of the global financial crisis, right? So think of the dictator being cast as the champion of national sports teams. There's one article from the Gambia under Yahya Jammeh, which is at the time until he was toppled in 2017, among the world's most repressive governments. There was one really great article. Great is there in scare quotes, I should emphasize, but one article where one of the country's athletes basically ended up crediting the dictator for his personal accomplishments on the athletic field. Anyway, so sports coverage ends up being as effusive as the rest of the coverage, where electoral constraints are non-binding, but subject to the same kind of admissions of bad news and policy failures as economic coverage as well.
Thank you for taking us through that. Again, kind of a really interesting look at something we may not expect to see or kind of have thought of maybe initially, but really does demonstrate kind of exactly what you've been talking about. Moving to a different topic covered, but again, kind of within the same general idea of the theory being proved in real life, is why do autocrats, I honestly was kind of surprised by this, why autocrats seem to spend a lot of time talking about kind of how good they look internationally, how much they cooperate with other countries, even countries that they may not like that much. Why is this such a thing?
Yeah, so it turns out, so we sort of think of there being kind of two broad varieties of international coverage in propaganda apparatuses. And again, international coverage kind of roughly accounts for somewhere around 20, say, to 30% of all coverage in the world's propaganda apparatuses, right? And so then the question is, how is international coverage shaped by the kinds of political institutions that we really focus on in the book? So we think of international cooperation as a government's efforts to engage internationally, right? So think diplomacy, think foreign affairs, etc. And we find that this international cooperation coverage is dramatically different across autocracies. So think, governments that are more constrained by electoral institutions. The government is cast as working with international partners to address vaccine shortages, which to my mind is a great example insofar as it kind of reflects both the government's efforts at international cooperation, but also the extent to which the government hasn't yet ameliorated the same vaccine shortages as well, right? Anyway, so governments that confront these sorts of binding electoral constraints cover these partnerships to to improve quality of life. By contrast, one of my favorite examples is Uzbekistan, in particular under Islam Karimov, who died a few years ago. Again, one of the world's most repressive governments. The propaganda apparatus made a habit of printing letters of congratulation from foreign governments immediately after elections, right? And so these letters from foreign governments are kind of noteworthy for two reasons. First, the identities of the foreign governments. There are sort of putative letters from the world's great powers, right, who are then kind of cast as supporting the Karimov government, which we think of as a signal to citizens that the international community isn't going to come to their aid, if mass protests emerge, right? So these letters are, the congratulatory letters striking for the identities of their senders, but also for the breathlessly effusive terms that the senders are said to have used. So one in particular was from Barack Obama. I can't imagine that it was authentic. I mean, it's just it was like so profoundly effusive, in terms of kind of trumpeting Obama's regard for Karimov, that it was just. Yeah, I mean, at some point, so we wanted to do like FOIA requests, to verify whether, actually, the Barack Obama government had sort of, ever sent such an absurd letter to Karimov. But anyway, so we think of them as sort of basically, a way of communicating to governments, or communicating to citizens that the international community won't come to their aid, in case they come out into the streets in defiance of this sort of obviously fraudulent election.
I cannot imagine, like, what would you even fill out in that form? Like, what would you say in that request? Please help us verify this ridiculous idea.
Yeah. So, and I should say, so right. So propaganda apparatuses, of especially repressive governments, actually do this quite frequently. So again, the Karimov propaganda apparatus would publish sort of testimonials from Western visitors, from ostensible, professors of foreign universities, in America, the UK, elsewhere in Europe, that kind of trumpeted the Karimov government's sort of political model. I think the Uzbekistan model of development. And anyway, so we tried to track down professors and sort of other policymakers that were quoted in the propaganda apparatus. And we were never able to do so. Anyway, so we think that there's a lot of there's a lot of creativity of falsifying foreign testimonials in propaganda apparatuses and in the most repressive environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Something I'd like to ask is less about kind of topic covered. Then you talk about the propagandist's dilemma, capitalized letters for each of those two words. What do you kind of mean by this?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we think of the propagandist's dilemma as something that uniquely confronts propaganda apparatuses in the presence of more binding electoral constraints, right? So again, in the presence of binding electoral constraints, our view of propaganda is that governments are forced to mix fact with fiction, right? They're forced to concede bad news and policy failures to gain some kind of credibility, right? Some amount of credibility, to manipulate citizens' beliefs kind of during moments of crisis, right? To manipulate citizens' beliefs when they really need to. And, and again, in more constrained autocracies, think, again, potentially, Putin's Russia before Ukraine, think Africa's post-Cold War autocracies, kind of the key moment of uncertainty, kind of the key moment of political tension is around election seasons, right? Election seasons, of course, are recurrent, right? And so again, as long as citizens know that the author of the propaganda is its chief beneficiary, then they may be inclined to discount it, right? Especially when the propaganda apparatus clearly has an incentive to manipulate beliefs around election seasons. And so, in one of the chapters in the book, we try to figure out exactly how governments resolve this dilemma, right? And so again, we think of this as as the propagandist dilemma. I mean, how to manipulate citizens' beliefs to some extent when they're expecting the regime to do so. So again, one of the chapters focuses on that, and so there we combine again our data across countries with again our field research in Central Africa and in Congo in particular. One of the things that we show so we document propaganda spikes, right? Moments of increased pro-regime propaganda relative to the rest of the calendar year, right? And we kind of define this quantitatively in the book. But we essentially are able to show that virtually all of the increases in pro-regime propaganda in more constrained autocracies occur around elections, which is sort of, again, consistent with our idea, of elections as these moments of political tension, of political uncertainty, when the government most needs to spend, the credibility that it acquires, at other times of the year. And so again, returning to this question, right? How to sort of, how to manage the propagandist dilemma. We show that, it's the kind of we show that a few things actually. First, pro-regime coverage kind of very gradually increases as election day approaches. Coverage of of the opposition increases pretty markedly as well. The opposition's criticisms of the government are covered extraordinarily faithfully. So in some cases, across Africa's autocracies, it's exceedingly common to find on the front page of the propaganda newspaper the EU's reluctance, or in some cases even refusal, to send election monitors for concerns about the election's integrity. Also, the government kind of conceding, opposition or covering opposition accusations of of harassment of its campaign rallies being blocked. Right. So anyway, so there's this really kind of like markedly kind of even-handed coverage. This notion that the election could go either way, right? The game isn't yet played, and we'll just have to see what happens. But then, as election day approaches, the propaganda apparatus kind of casts itself as covering the size of campaign rallies for the opposition relative to the ruling party, and then like very 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 gradually the propaganda apparatus sort of casts itself as like updating its predictions about the election's outcome based on enthusiasm, based on the size of the rallies, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so there's this, it's sort of very, very clear, that initially the propaganda apparatus is trying to cast itself as like a very, impartial arbiter of things. But, then as sort of enthusiasm, kind of differing rates of enthusiasm make themselves clear, then it kind of pivots to kind of preparing citizens to accept that the election's outcomes kind of indeed reflect the will of the people. And I should say, one tactic that is kind of particularly striking is the extent to which, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm sure elsewhere, autocratic governments kind of have puppet candidates that it kind of secretly finances behind the scenes, but that are these kind of like puppet opposition candidates, who then kind of reliably suggests that indeed the election has been fair, that they're willing to acknowledge the results. And kind of the key thing of this kind of puppet candidate strategy is uncertainty about whether these candidates are actual puppets. Anyway, and so propaganda apparatuses across the set of African autocracies that employ these puppet candidates tend to allocate them a pretty striking degree of coverage immediately before the election, right, and then in the immediate aftermath of the election, so sort of again kind of generate some foster some kind of uncertainty about the quality, about the integrity of the election. Anyway, so that's kind of what we think of as the kind of the key propagandist dilemma, and it's uniquely acute, we think, in the presence of more binding electoral constraints.
So what about then if we go the other end of the spectrum, right? The autocracies that don't have election cycles to create propagandist dilemmas or kind of dictate what the propaganda calendar looks like. Is there a propaganda calendar in those sorts of cases?
Yeah, this too is a great question. There's absolutely a propaganda calendar. In some sense, we need to be a bit more creative about what the chief moments of political tension are, right? And so, one key moment of political tension in the world's most repressive environments, especially, I should say, whenever in areas where governments refuse to organize national elections, there in those places, the key moments of tension are often anniversaries, frequently of failed protest movements or failed pro-democracy movements that the government suppressed. So think CCP China, right? The rate of protest around the anniversaries of failed pro-democracy movements increases by about 30 to 40%. The most obvious one is the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, right, on June 4th of every year. But there are a number of others of these failed pro-democracy movements. The CCP knows, of course, that these these political anniversaries are sensitive, and so the rate of repression spikes as well, right? Now, we think of propaganda around these pro-democracy anniversaries is driven by generally two considerations, and these are kind of opposing dynamics. The first is that employing propaganda or potentially threatening citizens during these very sensitive anniversaries would potentially threaten them, otherwise secure their acquiescence, right? Discourage, deter protests, right? So again, CCP China, effusive pro-regime propaganda, absurdly positive pro-regime propaganda. This, in our theory, is a signal of the government's capacity for repression. And so a propaganda spike around a pro-democracy anniversary would aim to discourage protests, right, by signaling the government's capacity for repression. Now, that is the kind of the benefit to the government of propaganda. The cost, however, is that propaganda would draw attention to a moment that the government would prefer citizens forget, right? And so we sort of think of this as a tension between memory and forgetting, right? And so the pattern that we find in the data is that most pro-democracy anniversaries in CCP China are, witness the sort of the propaganda. Most pro-democracy anniversaries in CCP China elicit no response from the propaganda apparatus, right? Which again, you can think of, as the government's interest in facilitating a process of forgetting, right? But there's one politically sensitive anniversary. There's one anniversary of a failed pro-democracy movement that the government knows citizens won't forget, right? That has a sort of outsized role in the public consciousness. And this is the Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4th, when some 2,000 citizens in Beijing were killed. I think these protests attracted, at times, some 10% of Beijing's total population. So, strikingly, what we find during the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre every year isn't really an increase in pro-regime propaganda, but instead coverage of its ongoing campaign of repression against the ethnic Uyghur population in Xinjiang, right? Which is kind of cast as kind of a threat to ethnic Han interests, cast as terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. And as your listeners are probably aware, the CCP's campaign of repression against the ethnic Uyghur population in Xinjiang now encompasses a network of detention facilities and has been called genocide by a range of foreign governments and international institutions. So the striking thing about this ethnic Uyghur coverage is the extent to which it emphasizes the government's sort of capacity for repression, right? And so we think of this as a way for the government, if it can repress ethnic Uyghurs to the extent that it is, then the government is sort of implicitly signaling to the urban population in Beijing via its propaganda apparatus that if they ever challenge the regime's survival, in the way that has happened previously, that they too would be repressed in the same way.
So that actually raises a question, obviously relevant to the CCP, but also more broadly. To what extent does propaganda discourage protest?
Yeah, so the final chapter, I should say the penultimate chapter of the book addresses this, and so we focus on, or we ask, or we try to answer this question in two broad ways. The first is by focusing on pro-regime propaganda, which again we do in a cross-country setting. We find that pro-regime propaganda has a pretty strong effect on reducing protests, but strikingly, we find that this effect decays over time. So, for instance, after about say 15 days, something like half of the initial effect has gone, and by the time that a month has elapsed, there's very little of the initial effect. But strikingly, this temporal signature ends up being very similar to political messaging in American politics, right? So again, you can sort of think of propaganda as a kind of political messaging, and its effect on protest, the persistence of its effect on protest actually looks a lot like political messaging in democracies. Then the other way we try to go about measuring the effect of protest is sort of again recognizing that propaganda isn't really just about coverage of the regime, but is also in many cases about explicit threats of repression. And so again, we focus on CCP China, where the government routinely advertises a social stability, a harmony narrative. So social stability being kind of widely acknowledged as code for ensuring the survival of the regime. And we show that whenever the regime kind of uses kind of social stability type code words, that the rate of repression, the rate of protest, falls pretty dramatically. So our view is that propaganda is actually quite effective, but for different reasons in different settings, right? In the presence of kind of more binding electoral constraints, because it's shaping citizens' beliefs about about kind of the merits of the government. But in the absence of binding electoral constraints, right, where governments can fully secure themselves with repression, our theory suggests that kind of the propaganda reduced protest because of the signal of the regime's repressive capacity.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you for explaining that. Before we get into kind of a even more direct linking between American politics and autocratic propaganda, I know that the list experiments about China and the CCP that is included in the book may be of particular interest. Do we want to maybe talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So as I've mentioned, we sort of think of propaganda as working through kind of two different channels. One, more persuasive in terms of regime merits. The other is kind of a signal of a regime's capacity for repression. Many scholars, I should say, are kind of many scholars have viewed propaganda as a way to kind of shape citizens' beliefs about regime merits. So to some extent, our kind of causal mechanism, linking, or in terms of in the world of non-binding electoral constraints, CCP China, right? Kind of propaganda as signaling the regime's capacity for repression is, to some extent, we think, kind of a much more controversial view, especially among scholars, who view the CCP as broadly popular based on direct question surveys, and who therefore view CCP propaganda as broadly persuasive about regime merits. So if one were to, just kind of, ask Chinese citizens, to what extent they support the regime, something like 95% of citizens routinely suggested they do, in direct question surveys. Our view is that these sorts of direct question surveys are pretty inappropriate in more repressive environments, since citizens have incentives to falsify their preferences, right? To conceal their private dissent. And so, kind of one way that scholars have begun to try to elicit private beliefs about things is something called a list experiment. So the idea is that we'll kind of divide respondents into two groups. One would be a treatment group, and the other a control group. The control group would receive three non-sensitive statements, and are then asked how many of those statements they agree with, rather than which, right? And so so they're given three non-sensitive statements. They'll say, "Oh, I agree with one," or "I'll agree with two," or maybe even all three. Right, so they're expressing preferences over the number rather than kind of a direct preference about a statement. Then the treatment group would receive those same three non-sensitive statements, but then also a more sensitive statement. In our case, whether they support Xi Jinping, or whether they support the CCP, whether they support kind of broadly the system of government, et cetera, et cetera. And then, right, so then we'll ask them to identify the number of statements with which they agree, right? Rather than are you willing to say that you support or that you oppose the CCP government, right? And especially in a world of online surveys, right, where digital surveillance is a concern, we think that this kind of anonymity is really, really important. So what we find whenever we kind of use this list experiment technique, first is that support for the CCP is far lower than scholars sort of generally estimate via direct question surveys. So direct question surveys return approval ratings of like 95%. Just using this list experiment technique returns estimates of like between 45 and 60%, right? Which is sort of far, far lower than what many people would believe. But we then use list experiments to try to measure whether CCP pro-regime propaganda generates an increase in kind of pro-regime views among respondents. And again, as our theory would suggest, we find sort of no increase or no evidence that pro-regime propaganda actually generates more positive views about the CCP, but that instead it increases the share of respondents who say they would not protest because they fear state repression, right? Which is sort of, again, exactly what our theory would suggest. So kind of most broadly, we think that using survey experimental techniques that kind of ensure or help convey a stronger sense of anonymity is really, really important. And whenever one does so, in the most repressive environments, then the effect of propaganda as conveying the capacity for state repression really tends to show up in the data.
Wow. Thank you for taking us through that. I think that'll be interesting to a lot of people. As my penultimate question, I'd love to stay on the topic of Xi Jinping for a moment, but also extend it to the US, because in the book, one of the things mentioned is that perhaps Donald Trump's use of rhetoric can be better understood by looking at Xi's strategy in China rather than the more common comparison with Putin.
Yeah, so there has been, in the wake of the January 6th, 2020 assault on the U.S. Capitol, there was a lot of attention to the notion of a big lie, right? The big lie in Trump's case that the 2020 election was fraudulent, but there have been other big lies, right? There have been big lies that the Orban government in Hungary has used to justify his dismantling of democratic institutions. Similarly, the Law and Justice Party and Applebaum has covered in Poland, has sort of also exploited a big lie. And Trump's big lies started early. Whenever his press spokesperson referred to the crowds in the Capitol that attended his inauguration as being sort of larger than any that had ever been recorded. Even though there were sort of obvious photos showing showing that was obviously not the case, even relative to Obama's inauguration 4 and 8 years earlier. So how should we understand these big lies? We think of so it's increasingly clear that democratic backsliding occurs due to executive overreach, right? Whenever elected presidents attempt to dismantle the democratic institutions that brought them to power. Of course, they need to get a sense for whether their followers are willing to go along with the dismantling of those democratic institutions, right? Or whether their followers will punish them for it. And frankly, in American politics at the moment, it's not clear to what extent Trump will be punished. So we think of this. We think of Trump's rhetoric, in saying things that are obviously false, as kind of conveying. Conveying to his supporters, kind of gauging whether his supporters will go along with his dismantling of democratic institutions, whether they will, to some degree, basically relinquish the truth. And so in thinking about kind of the magnitude of the lie, that lie has much more in common, with how Xi Jinping's propaganda apparatus covers him, than it does with how Vladimir Putin's propaganda apparatus covered him, at least before the Ukraine war. So we think that the analog for for Trump's rhetoric, is and this kind of big lie, the analog is Xi Jinping.
That's, I think, going to be an interesting lens for listeners to think about next time they read the news. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, especially given recent opinion polling in the U.S.
No, exactly. Before I let you go, would you mind giving our audience perhaps a sneak preview of what you and Erin might be each working on now that this book is done?
Yeah. So we're finishing second book projects at the moment. So Erin is finishing a book on the bilateral relationship between Washington and Beijing. The kind of the core idea is that domestic, kind of the domestic politics of the two sides has long destabilized the bilateral relationship. So In the case of Beijing, think the government's incentives to respond to economic crises that affect its elite, its kind of core base of support, by scapegoating the American government. In the case of Washington, think the extent to which members of Congress, due largely to electoral concerns, have resorted in the sort of China bashing that is sort of aimed at fostering support among their constituents. Anyway, so again, the idea is that domestic politics destabilizes the bilateral relationship, and then the second half of the book, she shows how the two governments have kind of therefore sought to change each other's politics from the inside, and so the book kind of charts how effectively they've been able to do so. I'm finishing a book on politics in Africa's post-Cold War autocracies. It's increasingly clear that the geopolitical environment is changing, right? There's sort of obviously a lot of talk about a new Cold War, a rising China, potentially a Russia that is becoming more active across the African continent via the Wagner Group. And so so as the geopolitical environment begins to kind of shift from the post-Cold War world, say that lasted between 1990 and say 2020, this seemed like the right time to kind of to do kind of an anatomy of how the continent's autocracies have worked during this 30-year period. And so that's the book that I'm finishing at the moment.
Both fascinating projects. Thank you for previewing them for us. But of course, while you're finishing those both off, listeners can read the book we've been discussing, again titled Propaganda in Autocracies, Institutions, Information and the Politics of Belief, published by Cambridge University Press. Brett, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.